I begin the talk with half excitement, half frustration, just because as somebody who's been in combo products now for 7 or 8 years or whatever, it almost feels like you're in a cycle of seeing the same topic over and over again and having to solve the same problems that a lot of us have talked about. Quick seizure warning, I'm a pacer, so apologies if that makes you seasick. I wanted to ask everyone a question around harmonization. And that is, what if harmonization wasn't just about aligning regulations, but about creating true synergy, where drug and device teams, sponsors, and CXOs can work together seamlessly to overcome challenges and deliver excellence? And from that perspective, I want to explore how we can redefine, perhaps broaden harmonization so that we can focus on the elements that are within our control. I did want to start by saying also, all opinions shared start and end with me and at one, sue me. They don't go beyond this general vicinity and envelope. A little bit about me, as Craig went through my introduction, that the actual details don't matter as much as to say, as with anyone who's worked in combination products, we've all started out as doing a hodgepodge of wearing every hat available, and then as an organization matures, you start to be more specific. Over the last couple of years, I've gotten to be really focused on the CXO space and managing relationships between a sponsor and the outsourced manufacturing that happens with some of our partners. I've also seen a little bit of certainly not an expert in international harmonization, but I do chair the international working group of the CPC, and I've gotten to get relatively close to the sort of regulatory problem. So I wanted to establish and broaden harmonization beyond the colloquially known harmonization definition of aligning global regulations. I wanted to speak to achieving operational harmony by focusing on what is in our control. Regulatory alignment is a key element of that, but also moving to internal and collaborative harmony, creating immediate impact in combination products. Essentially, it's more about creating a seamless ecosystem where regulatory is just an element so that we can grow in the same direction. The goal is obviously harmony, and regulatory harmonization is the one that's often talked about. The lack of alignment between definitions, the lack of alignment in approach, and we'll talk about that in detail. It is a problem. We all know this one, though. It's the longest to implement and deal with. We talked about 2013 being a big paradigm shift with the introduction of the combination product CGMPs and that being formalized into regulation, but that was a long time coming. And thinking of it as the start is, I think, not the correct way of thinking about it. Rather, think about it as the reflection of where the industry became. And so it just became codified eventually. This one is the longest to implement. It's the one that we have the least influence over. You can talk about advocacy strategies and that, but ultimately regulators regulate and industry produces product. And it's important, but I think it also has limited impact. And I think the proof in the pudding of that is we're all dealing with the different definitions in a way that not great, but it works. I do think there are two areas that have the lowest time to implement, that we have the highest influence over, and that impact our day-to-day operations and how we do business the most. And those two things are alignment between how sponsors and CXOs operate, and alignment between internal drug and device stakeholders. Jim talked about that in his talk in some detail, and we'll explore it further. My point is we should focus on these as well, and not just on the advocacy bit. So diving a little bit deeper into the three categories, regulatory harmonization is about aligning regulations to simplify compliance, facilitate market access for combo products. Sponsor CXO harmonization is about collaborating closely with our external partners to ensure QMSs are aligned. Regulatory expecting most companies have this designation of strategics. What it actually means, I think, is something that is still being figured out. And then lastly, internal harmonization continues to be a pain point where drug and device teams are just not aligned There's ununified leadership, ununified policies, ununified setups. And again, to beat a dead horse, I think these two at the bottom really drive most of our day-to-day. Now, Viktor Frankl is one of my favorite authors. If you know me at all, you know my favorite book is Quality is Free, but I put that in the last maybe 3 presentations I've given, so I wanted to change who the person is that's speaking in quote. But I think this quote carries through where when we are no longer able to change the situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. And I think when it comes to those two, the CXO sponsor or the internal harmonization, what can I do to influence change? So the first one is regulatory harmonization. What I don't want you to take away is that regulatory harmonization is not an issue. It really is. It's a big problem. And is it a problem? Absolutely. You can tear your hair out over this one and you'd be justified. As far as regulatory harmonization goes, what the actual problem is, the regulations, standards, guidelines are in some ways being developed, in other ways not aligned. And this is one of the main elements of my talk is that often stated as global harmonization, post-harmonization, and that's the only harmonization we really talk about. Let's talk about definition. What is a combination product? This issue is being addressed in a couple of different forums. It hasn't crossed over into the finish line. I know some folks here are involved in some of the definition discussions, and there are forums where regulators have been talking about this. But I think it's also important to note that when it comes to devices and drugs, those two elements by themselves are not aligned. Where you have a class 1, 2, 3 in one jurisdiction, it may be something completely different, and the same is true for drugs. Now, I want everybody to close one of their eyes, close your left eye, and try and spot the difference of the definitions. I actually recently found out that I don't qualify for lacing, and so I wanted to give you guys a vision test. But this summer, I will say actually, as part of CPC, the International Working Group did put together a database of all the international regulations for combination products. And so that's a super detailed list, but boiled down, most countries rely solely on primary mode of action for classification, or they lack a formal combination product definition. Where jurisdictions have formal definitions and pathways like the EU and the US, there's misalignment in approaches where, for example, the US has the streamlined approach and you're expected to do certain things, whereas the EU has the GSPR and they're not exactly aligned. And the challenge is obviously that a unified approach doesn't exist. There are more, though. There's variability in classification, approval pathways, and terminology from region to region. These can vary into specifics, but some places call it combination products, some people call it combined use, some people call it co-packaged, other places call cross-labeled versus referenced, and you can really go down a rabbit hole if you try and really understand the differences. There's also limited harmonization efforts. Like I mentioned, drugs by themselves are not harmonized. Devices by themselves are also not harmonized. Yes, we have some breadcrumbs that we can point to where combination products have a little bit more influence. If you look at ICH Q12 and do a Control F, you can see combination product mentioned a few times. But the reality is these forums don't have regulators who have a lot of experience in the regulation of combination products driving those introductions. Inconsistent technical expectations, so you have different requirements for testing, different expectations around HF, quality systems, and I think some of these are issues and others are perceived issues. We can talk about this QMS one in a sec. There's regulatory silos, so where there's great frameworks like MDSAP for devices, mutual recognition agreements on that are typically acknowledged, whether it's drug or device, are not acknowledged for combination products. And it's an evolving space. I did want to talk about the streamlined approach. So this is what we know, that drugs were regulated by 210, 211. 820 drives the device regulations, and the streamlined approach deals with the delta between the two regulations. I think the current limitation of this approach is it's US focused, but it's also not really reflected. It's not reflective of what most companies are actually doing. Most companies are using ISO 13485 as a basis, even if they're not certified to it. Most big companies, I should say. And the companies that are in the pharma space are usually leveraging ICH Q10. And this isn't really a regulation because neither ICH Q10 is a guideline and 13485 is a standard. But the real streamlined approach in terms of application is really the delta between these two, I think, for most companies. And I think with the emergence of QMSR and us and companies starting to have to harmonize to 13485 on the device side, I hope that we can come up with a unified solution that speaks to Q10 and 13485. And so that would involve a gap analysis between the two and some recommendation on process integration. Now, moving swiftly into sponsor and CXO harmonization. I think this area is an area of critical importance. You can see a guy jumping into a wall there. That's how I feel sometimes. And companies commonly will outsource either the design to a CDMO, development, testing to a contract test lab, or manufacturing to a CMO. But we all have our competency areas. Some suppliers may excel in either drug or device, but typically you'll have a difficulty finding somebody who's high on both. And then the issue is each company independently develops processes and expectations, essentially solving problems that have been solved over and over again. So what does this typically look like? It typically looks like a notification of changes. Every CXO that I've talked to talks about how each company has a different definition for what needs to be notified. As part of purchasing controls, we all know that notification of changes is really important whenever you outsource something so that you can assess impacts. But some companies want to be notified of every little thing. Other companies define critical, major, minor, and then they use that kind of approach. And it becomes very hard for companies to decide how to operationalize that, where they'll include some kind of statement in an SOP of like, reference, look at quality agreement whenever you have an issue. But beyond that, I think it becomes hard to operationalize. Sampling plans, every project does this over and over again. Reinterpretation of acceptance sampling plans. Are we using Z1.4, 20, and 59, or are we using C=0 sampling? And some companies do some kind of hybrid approach. And a lot of times companies will say, we want you to do it this way, even though for every other customer you do it a different way. And there's, I think, a lack of listening and understanding there. Quality agreements. This is an area where managing a bunch of clients on the CXO side is difficult, and dealing with conflicting requirements from a bunch of different sponsors who are effectively asking for the same thing. You to be a CXO and you have your multiple syringe filling lines, and then the expectations from one company to the other. Validation expectations. How are you doing PV? Risk management and QMS alignment. Jim talked about that, ISO 14971 versus ICH Q9, but also how do you integrate PFMEAs and risk assessments from a supplier into your device risk file? Code that has not been cracked. And then lastly, a space that I'm familiar with as far as audits go, you have a lot of CXOs who are managing multiple certifications, some of them they don't even need to try and meet perceived expectations from suppliers. So I went and audited a primary packaging site that only produced components, and they were carrying an ISO 13485 cert, a 9001 cert, and a 15378 cert. Because depending on the look of the draw of whatever customer you're working with, you may be asked to present one of them, even though they're not actually producing finished devices. So I'm going to go through this quickly. Obviously, streamlining this would lead to operational efficiency. I think the one thing that is most important to talk about is trust and transparency, where strategic partners are involved. I think having more harmonized expectations and more aligned expectations would drive for more trust in building those kinds of relationships. We'll get into the solutions for some of these a little bit later. I'm just kind of striving the problem now. Internal drug and device harmonization. Wouldn't it be so if it were like this, right? It's typically not. The integration between drug and device functions to achieve consistent outcomes is what we want. How it would work at the top is developing internal policy. Jim talked about charter that bridges pharma quality management and device quality management. And it matters because combo products straddle the two paradigms, and lack of unity leads to deficiencies. I wanted to peel back the onion and go back to this because I think a lot of people use this as a basis for culture, but it's really focused on regulation. So The streamlined approach is a gap assessment between GATE 20 and 210 to 11 in terms of how the regulations were set up between drugs and devices. It's addressing the gap between two regulations that were written to control two different types of products. It's not stating that drugs and devices are inherently different, rather that the regulations needed to be retrofitted to be able to maintain the two kinds of products. Now, this guy, I'm sure you all are familiar with, this is the drugs and devices are completely different guy. I'm sure you all have interacted with him. Don't be this guy. Yes, they have their differences, but breaking the they don't understand drug or the they don't understand device mindset is really important to driving internal harmonization. And I think this ends up being really behind a lot of the issues that we see is like device people have their blinders on and their ears closed and vice versa the drug side. And I think just the interactions that I've had with a lot of drug folks is that when you're working in a conglomerate that's very successful and somebody comes in and basically effectively says, you don't know what you're doing, instant shut off. And so we need to be able to, as device people, I think, communicate our messaging in a way that is more digestible and more focused on things that are actually happening. And this is also true between sponsors and CXOs as well. You have a company that's been manufacturing syringes for 2 decades, and then a company is going to come in and basically try and indicate that they don't know what they're doing. Rather, it should be focused on what are the actual important differences that you need to see for your own company expectations. Teamwork make the dream work, right? So solutions to this, cross-functional knowledge exchange between the pharma and device teams, listening and understanding from both sides, but particularly from device teams. I think this one is, some of these are cultural, but I've seen it across the board, and I've seen it with a lot of industry colleagues that I've talked to. A lot of times processes are not defined where they should be because of quote-unquote flexibility. And a lot of times programs will add in artificial constraints to try and satisfy a person's limited subjective experience that is not based on any kind of real requirement, but just would give an individual or a couple individuals a warm and fuzzy. Centralized project management for combination products. Some companies are doing that, similar to what Jim talked about, the charters. And so a couple of counter arguments, if you will, but global harmonization should take priority. While this is important, global harmonization is a slow process driven mostly by external forces. We have advocacy frameworks, and Heather talked about our industry's ability to comment on human factors guidances, and that those are available, so those channels exist. But I think collaborative harmonization is within our immediate control and can have impacts as far as the drug device thing. But internal silos are unavoidable. Those exist because of legacy systems. If we change our thinking and our processes after we change our thinking, that can lead to the dismantling of those barriers. But we can't standardize those things between sponsors and CXOs because it's proprietary. While I think proprietary information must be protected, standardization doesn't require sharing sensitive details by collaborating on some of the elements that are non-confident and effectively elevate the industry while maintaining a competitive edge. And that's very common as far as standardization work goes. And just a final slide on solutions. How do we reach harmony? Continue to focus on the global regulatory, prioritize that, but also prioritize collaborative harmonization internally and externally, advocate for global regulatory harmonization, and join industry forums where alignment can happen. A little bit more details. As far as the sponsor CXO harmonization, we can standardize quality agreements to align on expectations. On the pharma side, FDA has a quality agreement guidance. We don't have that on the device side. There's also forums that have expectations around what should be in a quality agreement. Collaborate on maybe defining further what the change management expectations are, and then join industry forums where we can drive the alignment between CXOs and sponsors. I'm excited to announce that we are starting a combination product working group at RX360, which is a supply chain consortium that has, as far as I can tell, most combination product sponsors and many of the combination products. So as far as internal harmonization goes, establishing clear roles and responsibilities to build integrated drug device quality culture, training pharma colleagues on device expectations, but also listening and learning from their experiences to avoid reinventing processes, avoiding the traps of flexibility and quote-unquote experience. And then as far as regulatory harmonization goes, continue engaging in forums like ASP and others, and advocate for the regulator harmonization forums like INDRF and ICH to drive for more focus on combination products. And then lastly, I think real practical streamlined approach, while not being regulatory focused, being practically focused, I think would be a really good day for the industry. And that's all I got. Thank you guys.